Former Governor Rod Blagojevich lost his bid to have his prison sentence reduced. We'll talk about that and more next on Capitol View. Thank you for tuning in to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science with the University of Illinois, Springfield. Kent, glad you're back.
Good to be here.
And Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program, also at UIS. Charlie, welcome back from vacation.
Thank you. I must say in northern Wisconsin it's a lot cooler than it is here.
And maybe a little quieter.
In central Illinois, yeah.
So we had a blast from the past this week. Former Governor Rod Blagojevich was making the case for reducing his prison sentence. He did not win that bid. Professor Redfield, why did he have the opportunity potentially to see a cut in his sentence?
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court has essentially, in reacting to some interpretations of the federal corruption statutes, had said that it had been construed too broadly in terms of what was honest services, what were the things in which you could bring corruption charges, and that resulted in some sentences being, or some cases actually being thrown out, and 5 of the charges that the governor had, I think 19 total, fell into this category. And so his defense team was arguing that given that the scope of what he was convicted for was less than what was at the present at the time of the sentencing, we should, he should get a reduction in sentence. And they brought out, all kinds of character witnesses and had a statement from the governor and the governor's family in front of Judge Zagel, which ultimately ended up for naught. The judge basically held that what he was convicted of more than justified the original sentencing, and so there wasn't any change.
And Charlie, it was the same judge.
I was going to say, one of the things that struck me was that the judge apparently, and Blagojevich appeared via closed-circuit television and gave like a 20-minute defense of himself, and he didn't particularly admit any guilt. He said, I made mistakes, and I wish I would have done things differently. And my sense was that Zagel would have been more amenable if Blagojevich would have come in and admitted, yes, I did something wrong. I committed a crime. I shouldn't have done it. I'm terribly sorry, and I beg for your mercy. That maybe would have gotten him something better. But as the U.S. attorneys argued, this guy is still not contrite. It's not, I did something wrong. It's that, it was a mistake.
Well, and the Judge Zagel was the judge that presided over his conviction as we watched that unfold.
And the original sentencing.
Any surprise from either of these two men, really, that it played out this way?
No, I think the governor is the governor. I mean, Rod Blagojevich, what got him into trouble was his personality and the way that he's viewed politics throughout his career. And, the judge was pretty adamant initially, and this go around too, that, what we're talking about is really an assault on, the political system, the legitimacy of the process, and that by bringing this disrespect and cynicism that the public has by his behavior reinforcing that does damage to the political system far beyond this one particular case. And so I think we were repeating the same theme again, that these were they're serious crimes because what they do to the legitimacy and the integrity of the political system. And if people don't accept the system and the process is legitimate, then the whole basis of representative government falls apart.
And of course, it took 2 trials to convict the former governor. The Supreme Court ruling that opened the door to this, Professor Redfield, will it potentially make it more difficult to get convictions like this in the future?
Well, again, he engaged in acts and criminal conspiracies which clearly were beyond the scope of what we're talking about. The rulings that involved primarily to the governor of McDonald from Virginia, I think.
I believe it
was. This was about the kind of, ambiguous, I'm giving you contributions, I'm giving you gifts, you're giving, are you getting access, or is the thumb on the scale a little bit, not having the quid pro quo, not having the shakedown. Like the governor, one of the allegations, one of the findings was that he was, shaking down a children's hospital in terms of campaign contributions.
Yeah, and it was kind of more than an allegation, because if you recall, they had the feds had Blagojevich on tape talking about the shakedown.
Yeah, and so bribery and extortion are still
They're
illegal.
Still illegal. even for public officials.
But the what we maybe call legal corruption here in Illinois.
The wink and the nod. What does that campaign contribution mean? Yeah, it is more difficult to prove that those sorts of things are in fact criminal acts rather than quote unquote politics as usual, and so that's going to make federal prosecutions more difficult in terms of establishing what is. What meets the criminal statute, rather than going for a more ambiguous kind of what you owe the public in terms of public service and honesty.
Any final thoughts on Blagojevich before we move on?
What really moved me, and what I felt really, really sorry about, being a dad who has 2 daughters, is his little girls. He deserves what he got for what he did. And I'm not as sympathetic for his wife, Patty, because again, if you listen to the tapes, she's in the background egging him on some of this stuff. But those 2 little girls, Amy and Annie, miss him terribly. You could tell. They were crying at the hearing, as is understandable. And he won't be around for the key moments in his life. He won't be out, I don't think, until 2024?
Yeah.
And by then, they'll be adults.
Yeah. And you would hope that both this, and if you look back at George Ryan and his sentencing, and then he tried to get early release because his wife was dying, and that did not happen. And those are personal tragedies. But if ultimately, there has to be a realization that there is a cost, there are penalties, and this is not politics as usual. This is not, acceptable behavior, and the consequences of this kind of behavior, both engaging in these acts and people tolerating them, is the very sad history that we have in Illinois of public corruption.
Standard & Poor's put out a report this week looking at how Illinois would fare if we were to face another recession. And of course, Charlie, recession wouldn't be great for any states, but this report said it would be especially bad for Illinois. No real surprise there. We kind of know why, but can you tell us a little bit about why, if this recession that folks have kind of said may be looming in the near future at some point were to hit, what it would mean for Illinois?
At some point, there will be a recession. And when a recession occurs, tax revenues plummet, expenditures increase because of social services, unemployment, more people on Medicaid, more people getting the kind of social services that the state traditionally has provided. And the reason Illinois is in particularly bad shape is because some states have kind of a rainy day fund set aside. They've kind of got a cushion that they could live off. Illinois is more like the guy who is going paycheck to paycheck or going to the payday loan to try and make ends meet. And if you look at the historical record, after the recession in the early 2000s and the 9/11 attacks, state revenues plummeted. And the state's budgetary deficit soared. Same thing after the Great Recession. Our revenues went down. As a matter of fact, I looked it up on a report put out by the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, and since 2001, in the 15 completed fiscal years since then, we've had 6 years in which the revenue has gone down. The first one was in the early part of the 2000s after 9/11, then with the Great Recession, and the third one when the temporary income tax declined. And we really haven't had a balanced budget in the sense of ending the fiscal year with enough money in the bank to pay the outstanding bills. We haven't had one of those since 2001, right before the events of the early part of the century. And as a matter of fact, the deficit for this year is going to be in the $3 billion, $4 billion range.
And not having, Illinois in some ways should be in much better shape because we have a very broad-based economy. We have lots of resources. We've got lots of different dimensions to our economy, and yet we have a revenue system that is not structured to deal with these kinds of situations. And when you've got a revenue system that's so heavily dependent on income without progressivity in terms of and then consumer spending, when you get these downturns, then it really it just accelerates it in terms of how. So if we had a better tax system, if we had better budgeting in terms of planning to provide for long-term, for, as Charlie said, for rainy day funds, then we'd be able to smooth things out. But we are, we're literally like, the family that's paycheck to paycheck, and you can't, if suddenly you wreck your car or you have an illness, then you've got nowhere to go. And that's basically where Illinois is.
Well, and we're even beyond paycheck to paycheck because we're letting the bills pile up, and we have a lot of past due notices coming in. But Charlie, the stopgap budget spent what little was left in our rainy day fund, right? I mean, there wasn't that much in there anyway.
It took money from the rainy day funds. It took money from all these other special dedicated funds. I don't know for sure, but I'd be willing to bet that Illinois has more dedicated funds than almost any other state. We have like 800 special accounts. Some of them are fairly large. For example, the road fund that pays for a lot of road-related work. But some of them are fairly small. For example, when people get their income tax form and they decide they want to make a contribution to some cause, curing breast cancer or habitat for non-game wildlife, they can mark and put $1 or however much. That goes into a dedicated fund. And what we've done in the last couple of years is, well, we've been doing it longer than that, but we've taken money out of these funds to cover expenses from our regular checkbook. So it'd be like somebody taking money, well, I don't know, I guess I can't imagine any family would have an analogous situation where you have
like a college fund that's specifically dedicated for.
Well, nobody has 600 different checking accounts.
No, that's true.
Not legitimately, I wouldn't think. But in any event, that's something you can only do for so long, because once you've taken the money out of some of these funds, it takes a while for them to build up. And the purposes for which the funds were created can't be adequately met when the revenue is siphoned off. That was one of the things that Rod Blagojevich did in his first year. He got the General Assembly to increase fees. He promised no new taxes, and he increased fees to the tune of more than $1 billion, and he swept a lot of that money into the general fund.
And now that's become kind of a normalized practice in Illinois. I mean, it seems like it's happening every other fiscal year now.
Well, and in the spring of 2015, to cover a gap from the last Pat Quinn budget, the Governor Rauner, and the legislature, the Democratic majorities and the Republican minorities, agreed to sweep money from funds to the tune of more than $1 billion with the proviso it would be repaid. Well, one of the deals in the stopgap budget was, well, we're not going to repay that money because we don't have it to repay, and furthermore, we want to take more. So it's really a difficult situation.
Well, and again, Professor Redfield, I mean, a lot of states have been struggling in the wake of the Great Recession, which we are out of, even though a lot of people maybe don't feel like we're out of. Are there any states that are well prepared or that are doing this right? looking towards a downturn in the future?
If you look at a state like Minnesota, actually California has done well over the last 2 or 3 cycles, and where you've and generally these are states that have progressive kinds of tax structures. They tend to you would contrast it dramatically with a Kansas, for instance, where we had huge cuts in taxes and then didn't get the kind of economic growth that people were talking about. Same thing happened to a lesser extent in Wisconsin. So you have to grow the economy, and you have to have a balanced and responsive revenue structure. And efficiency in terms of government, and we have had, we certainly haven't had the first two, and while the governor certainly ran on the idea we were going to redo state government, it's a little hard to redo state government when you have no money to do any of those things in terms of thinking about how we're going to deliver services differently, how we're going to reform certain things, and so we really haven't gotten to the kind of long-term things that we need to do, because we're just putting out fires, trying to figure out how to keep the water flowing and the electricity on, and that doesn't allow you to do much long-term planning or think in terms of broader goals, and that's where we need to be, and we're certainly we're probably farther away from that than we were when the governor took office.
Well, and part of it too is that some of the solutions that people are suggesting don't seem to be doable or don't seem to be practical. For example, there's talk about we have this huge unfunded liability right now, or as of I guess it would have been last fiscal year. The money that we have or are likely to have to pay retirement benefits is going to be in the neighborhood of $111 billion less than the value of those benefits over the next 40 years. And so the idea has been, well, what we've got to do is cut the benefits, right? And we've tried it, and the Supreme Court has said no. That provision in the Constitution saying that membership in a retirement system is a contractual relationship, the benefits can't be diminished or impaired, it actually means what it says in English. And so from my perspective, people are wasting a lot of time kind of spinning their wheels trying to figure out some way to get around that instead of doing some of the harder things that need to be done. And I think the governor's notion is that the way Illinois recovers is we have a booming economy, and the way we make it booming is to ease restrictions and regulations on business and curtail the power of unions. But those are ideas, particularly the anti-union stuff, that's going to not find traction in a legislature dominated by Democrats who traditionally are friends of organized labor. So I think there are more practical things that can be done, but people have to sit down and start to figure out how can we do it. Now, I would offer as a model what's been going on in the criminal justice area, the reforms that have come forward, bipartisan groups working together, passing legislation, governors signing it, with the notion of over time reducing our prison population, which is a big cost driver. We spend more than, I would say, probably close to $1.2 billion on prisons every year, which is much more than it was a couple of decades ago when we had many fewer people in prison because we didn't have these kind of harsh laws that were enacted.
It's roughly half what we spend on higher ed, right?
Depends on which budget.
Which
well,
year
yeah, that's
you're looking
true.
at. Yeah.
Historically.
Historically. And, how fragile, when we're talking about pensions, how fragile Illinois' economic situation is that, all of this is based on actuarial assumptions about rate of return. And clearly, the economy has not been, performing the way that we would like, and certainly not from a historical sense. And so you had the teachers' retirement system talking about reducing their assumptions in terms of rate of return, which
meaning
is
what they would make.
yeah,
off
how
of
much
their
they're going to
investments.
make, which goes into how much money do you have to put into the pension system. And so, we're probably going to be losing ground as we kind of average out kind of the steady but slow recovery from the Great Recession, and that just gives you, makes it all the more urgent that we get our fiscal house in order and that we figure out where we are with spending, where we are with revenue, get a sustainable budget that, you can take from year to year and start paying down the debt. And we're at least an election away from that, and I'm continue to be very pessimistic that there's going to be some kind of sea change come out of this election in November that's going to change the dynamic of the stalemate between the governor and the legislature.
Yeah, we already know for sure that the Senate Democrats will have a majority when the new legislature is sworn in next January. And the reason is, if every Republican candidate for the state Senate on the ballot in November wins, they still won't have 30.
Well, and while we're on the topic of elections and politics, as folks here in Springfield are probably aware, the state fair is kicking off, and that's always been kind of a marker for the political season in Illinois, at least the state political season. But Professor Redfield, we're seeing things heating up pretty early this year because of all the money that's flying around out there.
When I first got here in '75, after Charlie got here, but then the state fair was kind of the coming together and getting the candidates there and talking about now we're going to go out and do things, and Labor Day was always the traditional start of the election season. And we have been running TV ads and mailers, particularly funded by Governor Rauner through the House Republicans, to a lesser extent the Senate Republicans. We've been running ads against Democratic candidates for 6 weeks now, and we have a representative, incumbent Republican representative in Chicago who's doing Chicago TV, because they think this might be a targeted race from the Democratic side. So the election season has been going full blown, and that's a reflection of how much money the governor is able to bring to bear on this, and spending very aggressively, not only in terms of who they want to target, but they're also spending money in Republican districts where they think they may be getting a challenge. And so, the Democrats are at this point confident that, that the incumbency and the map and the resources they have, they're going to be fine, particularly in a Democratic state in a presidential year. But, this is a new dynamic in terms of how much money is being spent against the Democrats and how early the spending has started.
Well, and Charlie, we recently saw the governor sink millions more into this on top of the millions and millions he already has sunk into campaign funds. Can we expect that folks will just be sort of sick of all the ads and tired of the negativity when we get to November? Or?
That's always a good question. I've always thought, yes, they would be. But on the other hand, the people who are experts in political machinations keep pouring money in, and I assume they wouldn't do that unless they thought they got some results. I personally am sick of them, even though they don't appear on the TV channels I watch, which tend to be ESPN, with the same frequency that they do on the local stations.
Well, and what will this mean, as we've kind of touched on, when folks come back from the election? Do you think it'll harden hearts, or do you think that people will be ready to put all this politics behind them?
If there is, if there's a big swing one way or another, obviously it changes dynamic. If all we've done is spend, pick a number, $60 million, more than double what we've ever spent on legislative races, spend $60 million to turn out the base vote with a very, very negative campaign on both sides, then to say, well, now let's do the reset. Let's finally sit down and fix things for the good of the people of Illinois. I'm not sure on what basis you would expect that to happen. And so Maybe we're going to see something change, but I think this is likely to just poison an already, badly poisoned, dysfunctional situation.
Well, it occurs to me that in a sense the governor has already started the 2018 campaign with his talk about term limits. Toured the state promoting term limits. They've got an online petition for people to sign saying, yes, I want term limits, and oh, by the way, now you have a way to contact me for political solicitations in the future. And in my mind, term limits are a popular but relatively meaningless reform. And the reason I say that is because the way the legislative districts are drawn, if I'm a firm adherent of one political party and its philosophy, and the other party has the legislative seat, and 10 years from now, the guy who has the seat has to quit, and it's still the same dynamic in the district, I'm going to get another guy who's a clone of the first guy, and I'm still not going to like him. In my mind, if you want to change the dynamic in the legislature, you go to the basic, you change how the maps are drawn. Otherwise, you just keep electing clones.
And if we're, however you feel about term limits, this is about, leveraging the next election, changing the dynamic. It has nothing to do with solving problems. The term limit proposal that the governor has put forward is essentially it's a 10-year limit, and the clock would start ticking with the people that would be elected in 2018. And so you're talking about people being forced out of office. In 2018. So you'd be talking about 2028 or 2026.
2029 is when they'd have to leave.
And so the speaker should wish that he would live that long. I mean, he's probably in his late 70s.
He was born in 42, so next year he'll turn 75.
Yeah, so he'll be 85 or not, or at least 85, and so this does nothing to do with fixing the problems of Illinois.
And I hate to cut you off, but we'll have to leave it on that happy note. I'd like to thank my guests, Kent Redfield and Charlie Wheeler. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.